Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Phil White. I'm the founder and managing director of Audacia. I'm joined here today with Thomas Light, who's a solutions consultant from Audacia and was the project lead on the digital transformation project we worked on with Aesseal called Eve. So before we go into the project, just a little bit of background about Audacia. So we're a team of 50 people, a specialist consultancy and engineering company specializing in the software engineering background around building, designing, deploying business critical systems for multiple sectors, and have been doing so since about 2010. On that note, I'll just give you a quick run through of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the customer Aesseal, what they do, then a bit of high-level overview around the specific project we've been working on that was called Eve. We're going to split it into 3 sections. We're going to run through a little bit around what it was like getting started, the planning we did before start, how we kicked off the project, things we did, things we learned, things we could have done differently throughout the project, and then what, the challenges and things we learned around the international rollout towards the back end of the project. So Tom, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Phil. So Aesseal are a global company that operate in around 140 countries worldwide, and they deliver the high quality seals that large industry needs for bits of kit on the factory floor. So let's say we were a paper mill and we needed for some reason to process high concentration sulfuric acid safely. Aesseal would be able to provide the seals that are necessary to join bits of kit together on the factory floor and ensure that's done in a safe way. So if we hop onto the next slide. Eve is the system that was developed to replace several existing platforms. And this essentially streamlines our quoting process. So we're now able to take a product that previously would have required quite a lot of technical specification, probably quite a lot of in-depth knowledge for the sales engineer who specs these parts. And we've provided what is essentially a guided sort of wizard process to step them through that sales process and hopefully ensure that the customer gets what they need much more quickly and open that process up to a team of sales engineers all over the world that are able to identify the part they need much more quickly and easily now. System process is quite hard, sort of high volume of quotes and inquiries. We can see here that currently generating over 38,000 quotes per year.
And then we just have a bit of a chat around what it was like starting off the project.
Sure. So in terms of the business case, this was actually a really crucial aspect. What we often find on agile projects is that we have both the business case and a backlog of features that we've deemed sort of in a certain priority order. And in this case, it was quite interesting because we had a really strong business case. It essentially said that we've got a team of sales engineers, around 350 operating over the globe, and currently really requires quite a lot of in-depth knowledge to be able to specify these parts. So there are various technical calculations that are involved, and we find the sales engineers often need to have sort of 8 to 10 years of real-world experience before they're able to fully spec for every part in the Aesseal product range, which is quite extensive. So as part of the business case, we actually identified that by reducing the skill level required for those sales engineers to be able to spec these parts, we could actually increase the volume of inquiries generated, therefore hopefully sales coming in a way that actually allowed us to do this across a much broader range of sales engineers. There were various sort of quality improvements that come, if you like, for free along with that, in terms of being able to spec the parts much more safely and ensure that, for example, if we're using a highly corrosive chemical like sulfuric acid, we would be able to spec that part and know that the alloys that we're speccing will suit the conditions that part will have to operate in practice.
And who are the stakeholders that we were dealing with early, or you were dealing with early stages of the project?
Sure. So we have global sales teams all over the world, and each sales team has a slightly different structure, which is one of the bits that emerged as part of the analysis on the project. So in some jurisdictions, you might have a regional director who looks after a team of regional managers, etc. Whereas, of course, some countries have a slightly different hierarchy. So one of the key things that we needed to do on EVE when we kicked off the project was identify these various stakeholders, regional directors, might have been engineering teams in the UK, etc. And we needed to sort of rope them in early to really understand the different needs of different stakeholders around the world, because they were quite diverse. And that was actually one of the real positives that came out of the project, because we started that, what we call alpha and beta testing, as early as possible. We got some really valuable feedback, and critically we were able to action that feedback and show them the results of that quite quickly. So we always aim for a pretty tight feedback loop in that sense.
I suppose we were, as they're doing the analysis of products versus, custom engineering, we probably started joining the conversation as they were coming to the end of that conversation. I know that there was, a number of alternatives using SAP to do the product selection.
That's right.
One of the, what was the key things you remember from that conversation around flexibility versus speed of development?
That's key actually, because we're essentially dealing with what is a very extensive product range here. You get sort of core part families, and then there are various parameters that you can change that are made to order in the Aesseal product catalogue. Now, because the product range is so bespoke, and there are such a plethora of options there, we kind of had to build the system with that in mind. So while off-the-shelf systems were considered and assessed as part of this, it just made sense to build a system that was very specifically designed for this specific domain. So that's where we really went bespoke. We understood certain key product ranges that were the high volume sales ranges, and we delivered those first, sort of prioritized those right at the top of the list. Whereas other aspects of the system, so integration with SAP that was already in service, doing the job well, we didn't really need to reinvent the wheel there. But what AS were after, of course, was sort of tighter integration with that system. So we've already got the ability to look up stock levels, for example, via SAP. But we will be embellishing on that further so that we can actually get more tight communication, talking back and forth.
I suppose one thing we're very lucky with is they did, really adapt to an agile way of working very early on. When you hear, I think that statement there, software development, I think that was the statement from AES, software development is like building a house. You've got to get your foundations right before you start layering things on top of it. And I suppose if we look at what the backlog looked like on day one versus what the end product was, there is we learned a lot through the project. So presumably taking a waterfall approach to this project would have been.
I definitely feel that was the case here, yeah. And actually we've just secured further work with AES, and we're going to be working with them over the next year or so to add various embellishments to this system. So for example, I mentioned that we've only covered the high volume sales product ranges up to this stage, but there will be a lot of embellishments over the next year that add further ranges, etc., etc.
Okay, should we move on to what it was like day to day running the project?
Sure. So we follow the Agile Scrum sort of methodology, which involves chunking up all of our work into 2-week increments that we call sprints. So that starts with defining our requirements. So we define some tight acceptance criteria that's supplied by the product owner on the AES side. And really we try and get as much input at that stage from engineering teams or the domain experts to ensure that we've got a good set of criteria there. That sort of paves the way for developers or internal QA teams to be able to assess those requirements and get a feel for scale, etc. Close any gaps in terms of bits that we don't understand, that sort of thing. We then go through a sort of internal development loop where we have our own QA teams looking after ticking off that we've met these acceptance criteria. And then that gets handed over to the customer. The idea being that every 2 weeks, you should be able to release a new chunk of features that actually give real business value in practice. So yeah, quite a tight feedback loop, and ensuring that as soon as maybe if we veer off course, that we get corrected quite quickly there.
What were the big risks that we identified early on, or big risks that crept up?
Good question. So one of them, this was key actually. There are a couple of integrations. I mentioned SAP already. We also need to integrate with a design service. So that is, if we're specifying a mechanical seal and the client wants to be able to see that mechanical seal as a sort of technical drawing as part of their quote, we wanted to be able to integrate with that sort of 2D technical drawing service. So that was one of the things that, because it's an unknown, we need to push it right to the top of the list, just to ensure that we've got visibility always of what can be achieved by the time we get to the end of the budget. And I have to say, AES were fantastic in terms of being willing to jump into the detail there and identify really several months ahead whether something was still needing to be on our list or whether business priorities had actually changed by that point, which meant that we had to take an agile approach and sort of move our priorities around as appropriate.
How much of a challenge was migration and working with legacy data? Because I know this is effectively built on a platform of existing legacy systems, and I know there were a number of, we worried a number of potential blockers due to data flowing from existing systems.
That's right, and a lot of what we were trying to achieve there, because we were actually building on 3 or 4 existing systems. Knowing that, we needed to know that architecture would suit us not just over the next year or 2, but way off into the future. So that was a key decision early on, that we looked at our schema and said, this data is very much metadata. It's information that relates to AES's product ranges, but it's not, for example, pricing information. It might tell us which chemicals won't corrode certain alloys, for example. That's usually quite static data. And we were able to, at a very early stage, sort of silo that information off into its appropriate home. And hopefully that will serve us well as we sort of embellish the system in the future and build on that foundation. So I'd say that was critical, sort of making those schema decisions, which sometimes could take you by surprise, really at quite an early stage as part of our planning process.
Okay. And then if we move on to what it was like rolling the platform out across multiple languages, multiple currencies, multiple countries. So I should probably point out that was only recently. We successfully rolled out in March across all the countries in a single rollout.
Yeah.
Obviously, some of the key statements there is, we've gone for, there's an internal AS teams and there's partners, suppliers, customers that are all using the system, and it's just obviously very different relationship with those people, like how you onboard them and how you train them.
Indeed.
Interesting to have some insight into what that was like.
Sure. So the main thing here in terms of the internationalisation was ensuring that we had visibility of this early, rather than trying to retrofit something like translations for the whole system. And bearing in mind that we didn't have one thing to consider here. You've got to think about all the underlying data that feeds into the system, the various fields and field labels in the UI, including any reports that get generated, that sort of thing. And you've also got the quote output, so the artifact that the customer receives at the end of the journey. all needed to cater for a range of languages, but also any sort of specific behaviours for that territory. So that might mean different tax rules, different caveats when you're issuing a quote that are more suitable for that area, but might not apply to another geographical area. So what that meant is almost abstracting away some of these concepts and being able to say, okay, this field might be the quote title field. Let's ensure that we can simply plug another language in over the top of that. So that's now quite easy to maintain as well going forward. So when Aesseal hear that we've got a translation slightly wrong, and we've got a more experienced translator involved now who's decided to tweak that, we can actually manage those changes quite easily.
And finally, in terms of what we have next, I mean, are there any big things that we thought would be phase one that got moved out, or are there any big things that came up to be phase two that we just didn't know would ever be on the cards?
Yeah, I think the key there is AES had a great vision. They sort of understood their current sales volumes quite well, and that was what allowed them to create such a clear business case here. They knew where they were expecting to get the value. Now that that's been delivered, I think the key learning point that came out of that was the benefit that they're getting from this consistent reporting. So they've never had this visibility internationally of sales patterns. And I think that was a bit of a light bulb moment, if you like. We realized that by interrogating this data, we can actually get a lot of really useful stuff out of it. So as well as embellishing the system so that we can spec more product ranges, there's really quite a lot of changes in terms of reporting, being able to drill into that data and say, we're doing something very right in South Africa, for example. What is it that we're doing right, and can we apply that to other areas? So I think that will come in useful.
I think that's pretty much everything. We've gone right end to end. Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate your time today, and thank you very much to everyone who's joined us for this webinar. If anybody has any questions or they'd like to get in touch, my email address is there. I will leave it there. And hope you have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.